All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our very first UNWLA Book Club. And we're very excited that you're here with us today, even though we had to reschedule. Just a quick note that we are recording our meeting, and we're gonna share the link with everybody who registered and who joins. But we're gonna make the part with the discussion with William publicly available on YouTube. So the whole recording will be available to everybody who registered and who joins, but only the small part of the discussion will go publicly on YouTube. So before we dive in, I just want to say that today is not a lecture and it's not a test. And it doesn't really matter whether you finished Cassandra or you read just a few scenes, even if you're simply here to listen and explore, you are in the right place. And before we officially get started, I want to share some personal reflections. I reread Cassandra, and this is my very short summary. Like, you're a strong, independent woman. You know that your city is doomed. You try to warn your family and those people around you, but the truth is painful and it makes everybody scared and uncomfortable. And instead of coming together and acting on what they know, they turn against you. They call you mad. They treat you as hostile. They call you death sister, and they all think that you deserve it. And it made me wondering how long someone can keep speaking up before they just, stop. And Irena, I have a question to you. Did Cassandra feel more frustrating or more relatable to you? Did it feel more emotional or intellectual?
And Cassandra is a character that's been with me for, I would say, maybe the last 30, 40 years of my life, because I first read her in Ukrainian school many, many, many eons ago in the previous century. A newspaper, I don't remember which one, I think it may have been the Financial Times, used to have a rubric called rereadings. And
Mm,
the journalist who wrote this rubric would go back and reread books that he had read 20, however many years ago, and kind of weigh them to see if they stood up, if they held
mhm.
up. And Cassandra, and this is probably my sixth or seventh reading of the play, uh, holds up. She holds up incredibly well because there are so many things in it that speak to almost every age. And as we continue our discussion later on, I mean, I'll put in my 2 cents about Cassandra's position on truth and how difficult that is, and how difficult the whole issue of truth, well, not difficult, but how challenging it is in our day and age. So Cassandra stands the test of time. And what a cool writer Lesia Ukrainka was to have produced something like this that we're reading 100 years later and still, getting excited about it.
That's true. That's true. And thank you for sharing. And how about we do like a quick one word round with you, all right?
Mhm.
So, in your opinion, Cassandra, is she strong or is she lonely?
She's both. She's
She's
both.
both.
Her strength is her loneliness.
That's true. I was thinking about the same thing and I couldn't just stick with one. What about truth? Is it a gift or a burden?
You've got these questions. My answer is always going to be both, because while she is given this gift, she is also cursed
Yep.
by not having anyone believe in her gift of truth. So, can you
Yeah.
imagine knowing what's going to happen and nobody believes you, and you know that everybody's cursed, damn, Troy is going to fall, and nobody will take any precautions to protect their state because they don't believe her.
And that's actually, yeah. And that's actually my third and final question. Troy, is it doomed or in denial?
Again, it's both. Like all great powers, they think that they're invincible. And because, again, Cassandra is the bearer of this truth and they don't believe her, so they are deeply doomed and also deeply in denial.
That's true. That's true. Well, it's time we officially got started, and it actually brings us to our guest because many of the themes, like truth and women voices and power, are exactly what we're gonna try and explore today. Irana, would you introduce our guest to our audience?
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
with pleasure. Today we're honored and excited to welcome William Blacker, a literary scholar and translator based at University College London, where he teaches classes on literature and cultures of East and Central Europe. Thanks, William, for joining us. I also want to point out, I'm kind of really happy that we have several men in today's UNWLA Book Club launch, because I belong to several book clubs and they're largely female driven. So it's thrilling to have a little bit of testosterone present in our discussion. Thank you for being with us.
That's true. That's
So,
true. Yeah.
yeah. So, William, when did you first encounter Cassandra, and what stood out to you when you encountered this work? Did you react to it intellectually, emotionally? Did you like it?
Uh, First of all, just thanks so much for the invitation to come and speak to you. It's a real honor to be here. Um, I definitely liked it. It's really, I mean, I think Lesia Ukrainka for me is possibly the most interesting Ukrainian writer. I don't know. I mean, there's lots of competition, yeah, but she's definitely up there. And I think, your question about does it connect to you on an intellectual or on an emotional level is in some ways the kind of key to that because she has both. Like she's really someone who is operating on a very sophisticated intellectual level. Just the whole premise of the play. For a writer, a Ukrainian writer at the beginning of the 20th century to sort of think, I'm going to take on one of the great texts of world literature. I'm just going to rewrite it. And I'm going to explore all of those great philosophical problems that people have been thinking about for a couple of thousand years through this story. I'm going to take that on. And I think that's really courageous, and it just shows a real intellectual capacity that she had. But also, she's a writer who's kind of very much interested in, I think, even in the play Cassandra, also the relationship between the intellect and emotion. And the way that Cassandra, for example, the way she gains her knowledge and understands her knowledge, it's partly on an intellectual level, but it's partly also on an intuitive level, on the level of feeling. There's a letter that she wrote to Olga Kobylanska about this, where she described the way that Cassandra doesn't know kind of entirely rationally. She knows kind of irrationally or sort of subconsciously in some ways. And that's something that she struggles with. So this is a long way of saying both. Absolutely. It hits you, I think, on the intellectual level because there are really complicated and deep questions here, which I hope we'll get into, but also the tragedy of the central figure is really affecting, I think. But also in the text itself, we can see that she's exploring both the intellectual and the emotional and how they are in some ways in conflict, in some ways working side by side with one another. So yeah, there's lots to talk about, I think.
Um, I do have one question. Does knowing that Cassandra is a Ukrainian work change how you read it?
I mean, for sure, you when you know something of the context of the work, you you can understand it better. This is kind of one of those big questions at the heart of the study of literature. And, to what extent should we study literature as, a work of art that has a composition that has certain aesthetic qualities, which we can just analyze just on this kind of purely structural kind of aesthetic level. Or even in terms of, the arguments, the ideas put forward within it, we can sort of take them just purely on their own terms, or should we think about art as situated in society, situated in a historical moment, situated in a specific context? and telling us about something. This has been the big the study of literature around about the time that Lesia Ukrainka was writing sort of started to move away from that and think about, when we go towards formalist criticism and so on, we think we're not interested in history or society or politics. We're just purely interested in studying art and how it's made and how it functions. And then by the end of the 20th century, we come back to ideas that are very relevant to Ukraine, like post-colonialism, where art is understood as completely political. Um, so I think reading it, and knowing that it's a Ukrainian work, and knowing the context of Ukraine's situation as a victim of imperial aggression repeatedly throughout the centuries, does help us to understand it. But I think what's really important about this one, and which is absolutely what she was trying to do, is that you can read it not knowing that it's about Ukraine, and you can still understand it, and it can still be powerful and important to you. Um, and that's a very deliberate choice by Lesia Ukrainka. I think that she was absolutely trying to say to her fellow Ukrainian intellectuals and writers that we can't just constantly be talking about ourselves and our own situation, kind of looking inwards. We have to look out. We have to look towards European culture, to world culture. We have to have these kind of wider horizons and ambitions, aesthetically, philosophically. Think about ourselves as as a culture, as a citizen of the global cultural world.
Mhm.
Um, and in that sense, also universalizing the Ukrainian experience. So she's saying to the people who are reading her work, she's saying, we can look to other examples. We're not the first people to go through this. We're not the first people to face these problems. We can look to what others have said, and but not only learn, but we can engage, we can rewrite, we can change, we can put our own, 2 cents into this conversation, and people can perhaps learn from us. Which is, why it's so great that this translation has come out, because I think hopefully, people will be learning from what a Ukrainian author had to say about these questions.
Well,
That's actually, yeah,
so
go
much
ahead.
of Lesia Ukrainka's writing, particularly her dramas, come from the ancient world. They come from Greek myths, which raise universal topics, basically topics of love, hate, premeditation, all sorts of also doom, and all sorts of things, betrayal, and these are things that apply to every civilization, every culture, every nation, and every person. And it seems to me that Lesia Ukrainka was very, very sort of, she had a talent for making those universal topics, localizing them to some extent, making them more sort of Ukrainian than ancient. I remember seeing a play in Ukraine in the early 90s, Oderzyma, which is about someone who discovers the Christian faith and how she becomes more Christian than the Christians, kind of a thing, and how people get really, really caught up in these new ideas and so forth. And so, Willem, could you maybe speak a little bit to the sort of the universality of the messaging and the localization of the messaging in a play like Cassandra and some of the other works of Lesia?
Yeah, I think it's one of these. This is a really important question, and it comes up a lot in discussions of her work. I mean, it's something that she was criticized for in her own lifetime, by the more kind of populist critics who would say, why are you, how can you call yourself a Ukrainian writer if you're not writing about Ukraine? And most of her plays are not about Ukraine. She
No,
has
they're not.
uh, The Forest Song, of course, is absolutely a Ukrainian play, recognizably so. Boyarinya also, although not set exactly in Ukraine, but certainly the context. But most of the others are exactly like you said, it's biblical settings, or it's the ancient world, or it's, the sort of Baroque era of Spain, these kind of things. Um, and I think, yeah, I guess what she's doing is trying to plug Ukrainian culture into this much bigger cultural world. I think it's trying to move away from the idea that we can be sort of entirely self-sufficient culturally. And that culture always exists in this complicated network of influences and ideas and trends, which goes way beyond the borders of any nation. And of course, we can construct a national identity using those things. They don't have to be necessarily in conflict with the national identity, but I think for me, the message is kind of if we want our national culture to be kind of fully fledged, to have all the different levels of intellectual and cultural achievements, to have the necessary depth to kind of last and be to sort of meet the challenges of the modern world, then we have to learn. We have to learn from others, and we have to make that contribution to world culture. So I think she's absolutely she's everything she does is working on this tension between like the universal and the local. But she's definitely one of those who's kind of really pushing us towards the outer limits and towards the universal. Of course, if all of these plays are recognizably saying things that are absolutely crucial for Ukraine. It's not like, Cassandra is, of course, it's completely relevant to Ukrainian situation in her time and in our time. It's very easy to see that. But um, there's an extra kind of power, I think, in saying, I'm going to speak about this by appealing to the cultural authority that lies behind this material. I mean, there was a question of when can we understand this or do we understand it differently if we know it's a Ukrainian author, or do we need to know that it's a Ukrainian author? I mean, I think another question is if we are not so familiar with the Greek mythology, can we understand it? I think that's more of a challenge. I think if you're someone who's never encountered the Iliad or, the story that's behind this, it can be a little bit disorientating, kind of figuring out, remembering who all these people are and how they relate to one another. It's kind of a play that's, and this was a criticism that was aimed at Lesia Ukrainka, that it's a kind of elitist. It's a bit elitist. It requires a certain level of education. Perhaps requires a certain understanding of the myth before you get to it, before you come to it.
There was a
Um,
time when the Greek myths were just standard things that you learned in sixth and seventh grade in the American education system. So
yeah, I mean, and
Well,
it applies
they
to us as
still
well.
do.
Yeah.
really, okay,
Yes,
good.
they still do. Um, One of the central parts and one of the central ideas in the play is Cassandra's curse. How do you interpret it today? I'm sorry, as fate, power, punishment, or something else? So, again, is knowing the truth a gift or a burden?
I mean, I would agree with what Irina said before. It's definitely both. And I mean, the story, the origin story of Cassandra is also kind of interesting in that regard. And this is not part of the play itself, but and maybe some of us on the call know, maybe not everybody knows, but how Cassandra gained her gift of prophecy in the myth. She gained it because the god Apollo fell in love with her, and she was a mortal woman. And she refused his advances. But then she kind of eventually, after he was very persistent, let's say, she capitulates and says, "Okay, but as long as you give me the gift of seeing the future, which is kind of one of the things that he's responsible for as a god." Um, and he gives her the gift, but then she changes her mind. So she in a sense she fools him.
Mhm.
And so as a vengeance to for that, he curses her by saying, "Okay, you have the gift. I can't take it back from you, but you won't be believed." And also part of the curse was I believe that you will also doubt yourself. And I think it's very interesting that we can talk about the gender dynamics of the play itself and the way it's particularly a woman's voice which is not trusted and not heard. But even the origins of this story have this very interesting gender dynamic whereby it's all
Hmm.
comes out of this kind of power relation between a man and a woman. And a woman who is sort of resisting and trying to outwit this male figure that has power over her, and does so to a certain degree, but with a kind of sting in the tail. Um, so I think it's, and I guess the point of the myth is really to do the same thing that Lesia Ukrainka does, which is to um, teach us about how complicated the truth is and how, that we think that telling the truth is very simple because things are true and things are either true or they're not true. And you should tell the truth. It's a good thing to tell the truth and it's bad to not tell the truth. But, the play is all about how it's really not that simple. It depends who's speaking. It depends who's listening. It depends in what circumstances. Being faithful to the truth can be something which can test your resolve, which can isolate you, which can lead to persecution, all of these kind of things. And she really develops those ideas in a really interesting way here. But I think she also pulls out this kind of, you know, gender dynamic in the myth that's there right in the beginning. But she just kind of develops it, what's already there.
Cassandra is treated in the play very much as a commodity to some extent by her father, by her brothers. In the way that she is sort of forced to accept a marriage that she doesn't want. Um, that was a way of doing things at a certain time. Daughters were a commodity, and they were used to sort of, to build alliances, to gain friends and influence people, that sort of stuff. But taking truth and taking the messaging of truth that Cassandra does and comparing it to another seer in the play, her brother Helenus, who's a terribly cynical person. And there's this great dialogue between the two of them where Cassandra stands by her guns. And for her, the truth is so painful. It wears on her. This burden is literally killing her. And he's just sort of very glib. And he says, well, that's what you get for saying what you're saying. And I tell them what they want to hear. I tell them what my bosses want to hear. And they're happy this way. So I mean, we're living in an era as well where the things that the truth sayers are saying things that a vast majority of the public doesn't want to hear. And so in that regard, I think she was extremely prescient, and she's very modern in this sort of messaging that she raises in this particular play. I mean, do you think, William, that had Cassandra been a male, she would have been treated differently? I mean, I think it seems to me that we have two things going at each other here. Her role as a woman, as a bearer of truth. And then we have the whole issue of truth as a concept, as an idea, as a value. And I don't want to say that they're in battle with one another, but they're kind of, it's on the scale of a sort, her womanhood and the fact that she's a woman and her capacity to bear truth. And then her brother, who's a male, who can tell anybody any piece of bullshit and everybody's going to believe him.
Yeah, and it says a lot about the people who want to believe. It's a real critique of the society. Yeah, I think that, if were Cassandra a man, would she be treated differently? I think for sure. Certainly. Certainly extra expectations are placed upon her, extra scrutiny.
Hmm.
And it's also not just what she says, it's also what she does. Like, as you suggested, there is this moment where the question of her marriage to the king who comes to the aid of Troy in exchange for marrying Cassandra. And so here, she's again raising this question, which is absolutely central to women's role in society then, but also in her own time. That women's freedom to make their own choices in lives, women's control over their own what they choose to do in their private lives, what they choose to do with their own bodies. That we see, this is a very clear example of that. And she also, the character really challenges this very, very openly. Even though she kind of again gives in, but she gives in when she knows, she understands that basically he is doomed anyway. Um, I think that in terms of the question of her ability to speak the truth is interesting, I think, in another way also. Because we have this question of um, the relationship between language and reality. And she says, and people accuse her of, well, this happened because you said it. So it's not that she's foreseeing the future, but they don't know what she sees, what she knows, but they know what she says. And then they know that it happens. So then there's this logic that, well, you made it happen by saying it. And this also is an extremely modern idea. This is something that even in her time had not really been sort of thought through by linguists and philosophers to an extent, but over the following century would be, and that's the relationship between language and discourse and reality. And is reality just a construct constructed in language and discourse? Um, and that's something that's extremely relevant to our day as well, when we have AI, when we have, social media, when we have the ability to present states of affairs in ways which have really very, very tenuous links with the actual events, actual reality. But we can do so through language, through images, through the construction of narratives. And in some ways that brings about those states of affairs. We can take a question of um, there's a lot of let's say discourse in media about there is tension in society between this group and that group. And the presence of, I don't, not without getting too specific, but the presence of X group of people within our society is a huge problem, and this and that, and look, they commit these crimes and they do these bad things, and they're bad for our society for these reasons. There may have been no tension in actual fact, but because of the media discourse can then create the tension. So we have a political issue that was not there, but can be created through language, through discourse. Um, and this is something that, we find in Michel Foucault's philosophy, yeah, much, much later. So she's, in that sense, she's way, way ahead of her time in thinking about the relationship between language and discourse and reality, and which comes first. And in the play, it is kind of, we can see that we can debate, to what extent the things that she says or the things that others say influence the course of events. Because we know that her comments to King Oenomaus are overheard, and then they come through to his soldiers, and then so maybe the prediction did have a demoralizing effect on the soldiers, and then it influenced reality. Yeah, so we have just this idea of, if a self-fulfilling prophecy. There is such a
Exactly.
thing. So she's also raising that event. It's not just about someone being believed or not being believed. It's about a much more complicated relationship between speaking about reality and the reality.
You
Well,
know what?
Go ahead.
I'd like to add to that. Oksana Zabushko, prominent Ukrainian author and intellectual, she says that Hellenis is intellectually the most brilliant of Ukrainka's scoundrels. psychologist and a manipulator of
Manipulator.
collective consciousness. And the central idea, the central line of this play is that as long as I don't see something or hear something, it's not there. It's like a very infantile approach, and it's very well encouraged by others.
It's
So
the three monkeys: see no evil, hear no evil, say no evil.
and my question is, what role does denial play in a collective catastrophe?
Well, I mean, I think you don't have to look too far to see
Well, yeah.
the role of, I mean, we can think about many examples, but I mean, let's say climate change. This is the facts are all pretty much staring us in the face, but there are still people with a lot of power who say that it's all a hoax, that it doesn't matter, that it's and who discredit the people who say these things, who we have this whole discourse in kind of populist politics, the anti-expert discourse. This was a big thing in the UK for some years. We had a government which seemed to adopt a strategy of discrediting experts. We've had enough of listening to experts. The people know what they want. This kind of idea. So I think that's absolutely what she's trying to get at with Hellenist. And Hellenist, absolutely, and what is great, I think, and this is for me one of the strongest parts of the play is the dialogue between Cassandra and Hellenist, because who wins that argument actually? It's very hard to say. And I think Lesia Ukrainka, she's a very sophisticated writer. She's not a didactic writer. She is a writer who will present you with very difficult questions, and she will present different points of view. And she's not telling you the answer. She's telling you to figure it out for yourself. And in order to do that, you have to have antagonists who are convincing and maybe even appealing in some ways. And you can absolutely see Hellenist's position. And also, think about the reality. We can think of many examples where his position would be correct. Like people shouldn't know the truth. It's actually bad for them to know the truth. It's going to be harmful. Any state which is at war does not give everybody full access to all the information about what's happening. This is a very relevant example. The Ukrainian government isn't going to tell us all the stats and all the data about exactly what's happening on the front line for security reasons. For security reasons, but also for reasons of morale. And um, is that do we think that's a bad idea that we don't have access to the information, we don't have access to the full truth? I think you can make a strong argument that there are some things that, yeah, the population doesn't need to know or shouldn't know. And he is kind of making that argument. He's not making some kind of argument coming from a place of he thinks that he's acting in the best interests of his community.
But at the same time, he's depriving the people of a choice.
Yeah.
He's not giving them freedom of choice in terms of what they believe. And that raises its own problems and issues and questions.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, we see, I guess, in the end, I suppose there is a message in the end, and we see what happens. It turns out that hiding the truth from people didn't help.
Yeah.
It wasn't a solution.
Can we just talk for a little bit about truth, the whole idea of truth? We have now you mentioned language and discourse and reality. We have words now or concepts that somehow characterize our age and our attitude towards truth. So about 5-6 years ago, the Oxford Dictionary coined the phrase post-truth. When Donald Trump was elected to the presidency in his first term, one of his counselors, oh God, what was that blonde's name? I've forgotten. Kellyanne Conway coined the phrase alternative fact. And the Rand Corporation out in California has for the last several years also been talking about something called truth decay. Now, I'm one of those maximalist people. For me, truth is real. It's and it's concrete. Yes, there are nuances and so forth and so on, but there is such a concept as truth, a moral truth, a philosophical truth, a physical truth. How do we look at truth in the context of this play, but also in the context of our age? And the messaging that Cassandra and Lesia Ukrainka are giving to us, you said that it's not clear who wins that argument, Hellenis or Cassandra. So this is an argument and a conversation that I think that humanity is probably having for centuries, if not millennia. And is it possible to win it, or is this just a conversation that will go on forever?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know if it's a problem that we can solve necessarily. It's probably the boring answer is that it depends and it's complicated. Um, yeah, I feel like there is.
But can we speak in can we use the word truth in absolute terms? Is there such a thing as absolute truth? You know, if you haven't read Aquinas and Schopenhauer and everything else.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's it's a big question with many aspects and many dimensions. Um, I mean, I think what I guess what I get from reading the play is it's not so much the dangers of the truth or the dangers of lies. It's more about the dangers of a closed society or a society where access to the public sphere, to the public discourse is controlled and limited. It's a kind of an argument for freedom of speech, I suppose. Um, so because Cassandra is afraid to speak because she faces public criticism. She faces censure from her own family, which is the ruling family. She faces potentially being punished. So she's afraid to speak. The society is afraid of people speaking, and people are afraid to speak. And that's really, and that's not the same question as what is true and what is not true. Um, it's a question of being able to air ideas even in the face of doubt and even in the face of uncertainty, being able to have them openly discussed in a way that's on a kind of level playing field, in a way that's not where information is not controlled for unclear purposes by people behind the scenes for manipulative reasons. It's a kind of yeah, it's a more ideal kind of public sphere which is open. It's an open society, I suppose. Um, and I think that's very important. It's this idea that we don't necessarily have to be convinced that we know the truth, but we have to be able to have that freedom to explore it and maybe to be wrong, but to have the safety to be in an environment that is tolerant of those things. And that's another thing that, we can, I think she knew very well what that felt like, the way that the Ukrainian kind of literary world in which she operated could be quite fractious and there could be quite harsh criticisms made because obviously the stakes are high. So people are really, there's a real sense of people have to live up to their duties as Ukrainian writers and their duties to the nation, and you could be harshly judged for doing the wrong thing. Um, so she understood what that felt like. But we can also understand, I think, what that feels like in the way that, let's say the way that public discourse happens online. I think a lot of people are afraid to take part in that because of the nature of the online public space, which is on the one hand, yeah, everybody has access to it, but it's a very violent and manipulated place. And it's not a free kind of open public square in the way that it should be, the way that it was imagined, the internet would be. It's very much the opposite. The information is controlled by people behind the scenes who we don't know, who we certainly didn't elect and who we don't know much about. And they manipulate that public space in order to create conflict, because obviously that generates clicks, that generates advertising revenue. That's how these companies make money. So we can, I think that warning is relevant to us today as well in many ways.
Irena, I do have one more question that I think we can use as a wrap up of this part of the discussion. And I think it's very easy and simple. Do you feel sympathy for Cassandra?
Are you asking me or William?
William.
Of course, yeah, of course, absolutely. She's a very tragic figure. I think she's also what's interesting is that she is also flawed and nuanced. She doesn't quite understand. She doesn't know what to do. She's not this kind of fearless warrior for truth.
And she's very open in her helplessness.
Yeah, she feels helpless. She feels vulnerable, but she also had these moments where she can really stand up for herself and kind of hold on to her integrity as well. And I think that's a very interesting character to read about. And I felt, I feel a lot of sympathy for a character like that.
I read a book some years ago, also called Cassandra, by an East German writer, Christa Wolf. And I highly recommend it to people who are interested in the character of Cassandra. And it's somewhat similar to Lesia Ukrainka's play, but it's the story of Cassandra as told by herself. And these issues of loneliness, the voice in the wilderness that no one believes, how she's treated after Troy has fallen. It's a very, very compelling book and well worth a read. So I consider this a plug for that particular book. I don't know if it's been translated into Ukrainian, but the English translation is very good. And Christa Wolf is one of my favorite writers. And she, like Lesia Ukrainka, also raises almost the same issues, of truth, of commitment, manipulation, and so forth. So it's quite good. Sister writers, so to speak. So William, I think we can open up the discussion.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for this really incredibly interesting and thoughtful conversation. And like Irena said, now we're going to open the discussion to everyone. And I'd like to open the discussion with the question, which emotion did this book leave you with? Was it sadness, frustration, anger, or something else? So you can raise your hands and we'll let you speak up. Or if you feel more comfortable typing, you can leave your comment in the chat. But let me remind you that this is your chance to ask any Cassandra-related questions that haven't yet been answered. So anyone who is willing to speak?
Not all at once.
Or just you don't have to ask questions if you don't want, or you can just simply share your opinion or what you think about the play, especially if you read it for the first time.
Hi, Anna. I'm sorry. I am not able to raise my hand because I'm driving.
Okay. But that's okay. Yeah.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you so much to you, Irena and William. It's absolutely amazing. I definitely enjoyed it. And my question is, what does it say about us as a society that whatever Lesia Ukrainka wrote about 100 years ago is still, we still can definitely talk about it right now and we still have the same problems.
It's still relevant.
Yes, it's still relevant. Sorry, I couldn't remember the word.
Yeah, I mean, I
And I
think
guess my question would be to all three of you. Maybe like all three of you can just give me your piece of opinion.
I mean, I think that she is one of those writers who really this goes back to kind of what I was saying earlier about the way that she's universalizing problems and not focusing too much in detail and narrowly on her own immediate context is that gives the work longevity. Um, you know, going for biblical material or material from Greek mythology, that really helps you to do that because this is material that already has proved itself that has longevity in culture. These questions, people have been talking about these texts and these problems and these ideas for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. So if you want your work to have this kind of resonance and relevance, this is a pretty good idea. It's a pretty clever idea to engage with them and step into that, and kind of sail down that river. So that really helps to make the work relevant for us today, because people in her day were reading the Iliad and we are reading it today, and we know the characters and we know the story and we know the problems. So that kind of longevity is sort of built into these texts, I think. Absolutely. Um, yeah, the fact certainly we haven't solved the problems that she raised, for sure.
I would also,
In some ways,
sorry,
they just seem to have got worse. I don't know.
I would also like to add that this play raises questions of and issues and talks about issues of gender, authority, credibility, and it highly resonates. This whole story highly resonates in today's world of misinformation and different like political conflicts. And last night I was listening to an interview with again Oksana Zabushko, and she also mentioned Cassandra, how relevant this play is still is today, because it talks about like it actually in this play you can see how political technologies are being formed and developed. That's why it feels so relevant today.
I would just add that these universal issues don't change, but society changes, people change, and how we approach these universal issues changes. So that formula in and of itself will keep writers like Lesia Ukrainka relevant forever. And each generation comes to a classic work of art with its own prejudices, with its own viewpoints, with its own expectations. And basically, every generation, every society rediscovers these classics for themselves. And they think that they're experiencing it completely differently than anyone has ever done before. But we're just layering sort of literary and social experience with every reading.
I do see one question in the chat. So that's the question from Natalia Pavlenko. She's the president of UNWLA. So she's saying that we're having a great thought-provoking conversation, and the question she always comes away um, from when she reads Cassandra is it better to be ignorant or to foresee disaster and be powerless to stop it? So what do
Yeah,
you think?
this is absolutely one of the central questions. I mean, it's also it raises a question which is and an idea which is in a lot of Greek mythology is sort of predestination and fate, and usually the belief in the Greek myths is that you can't change your fate, and kind of those who try to outsmart fate are foolish, and they always get some kind of punishment for trying to avoid their fate. And they usually try and avoid their fate in very kind of roundabout ways, which are not very effective. Like because with Troy, there is the prophecy that when Paris is born, that who is the youngest son of the king of Troy, that his existence will lead to the downfall of Troy. So, but instead of, they decide that, okay, we have to get rid of Paris, because that's not a good thing, but they don't just, kill the child. They put him out into the wilderness and hoping that the beasts will do the work for them. And of course, that doesn't happen, he survives, and then he comes back, and the whole war starts kind of because of him, and it leads to the fall of Troy. And it's sort of interesting that that Lesia Ukrainka is interested in those problems in some of her works, but in some of her works, she's also very interested in early Christianity. And of course, the idea of fate and free will is very different in Christianity, because one of the big ideas in Christianity is that God gave you free will, and that you can, and then so we have the idea of sin and so on. So we do have some kind of control over our lives. And I don't really have a sort of solution to what exactly it is about these two different conceptions of free will and fate that that she's trying to say through this, but I find it interesting that she's very interested in both. You mentioned Oderzyma, so in Oderzyma, we also have a question of prophecy, because obviously the Messiah has to kind of fulfill this prophecy that he will die for the sins of humanity. And she is resisting that. So and Miriam in the play is absolutely resisting this prophecy that is like completely at the heart of Christianity, which is, of course, one of the most important things in European culture and in Ukrainian culture and everywhere. This idea and this prophecy and this fact, that Christ died for our sins. And here we have this character who's doing this absolutely kind of sacrilegious thing, who's saying, I don't want that sacrifice. I don't like that sacrifice. I want to fight against this prophecy, and asserting a kind of will over that. So I guess you can see her struggling with these big concepts. I know that I'm completely not answering the question. But
I personally
yeah.
think that the question has no answer. It's a kind of it's an endless discussion that we're doomed to have for as long as we live on this planet.
That's true. That's true. I do have a question. Well, I don't know if that's a question, but I do have a raised hand from Irina. I'm gonna unmute you. Hold on a second. So.
Oh, I unmuted myself. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Yes. All right. Go ahead.
I wanted to say, well, thank you for this amazing conversation, thought-provoking and always important. And answering your question, I wanted to say that reading this book always makes me, yes, sad and frustrated, but at the same time hopeful, because I see Cassandra as Ukraine starting at the early 20th century and until now, fighting and speaking our truth, talking about our challenges to the world and not always being believed. And finally, now Ukraine is being heard through all of our media, all of our activists, President Zelensky. And not everybody believes Ukraine yet. There's a lot of propaganda and gaslighting, even in the political sphere. But Ukraine is Cassandra right now. And it's also interesting to me that at the beginning of Cassandra, Lesia Ukrainka compares Helen of Troy to daughter of Epimetheus. So that's the other titan who was foolish and ignorant of the consequences of his actions, and he was happy. And in turn, she is the daughter of Prometheus, his brother. I wonder if that was the first time she kind of compared herself to the daughter of Prometheus, or that was trend that she was saying, that I feel like right now we are also daughters of Prometheus in this way. And basically we have a choice. Either we want to be vocal and talk about our truth, or do we want to be happy-go-lucky and just ignore, well, not just us, but all the people of the world? Do we want to be knowing of the and conscious of what's happening, or do we want to be ignorant?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and it kind of speaks a little bit to one of the questions that you on the list of questions that you sent, which was I thought was a very interesting one. Have you ever felt like Cassandra yourself? And I
Have
think
you?
that, well, I don't know if I'm, the right person to say that I feel like Cassandra, because obviously I'm a man and I'm a Western white man, and people tend to listen to us. But there have been times certainly where I operate in a field in academia certainly where speaking about Ukraine and from the perspective of Ukraine has often been kind of dismissed. And Ukraine is, things kind of changed after 2022, but not entirely. It wasn't taken that seriously. And certainly looking at public discourse, but also academic discourse. Ukraine so often understood through Russian perspectives, through the voices of experts in Russia. So how many times have we seen, media turn to a Russia expert to speak about Ukraine? I mean, it happens all the time. It used to be much worse than it is now because now, like Irina said, there are more Ukrainians who are out there in the public sphere speaking. A lot of the time, those people are women. I think a lot of the most powerful voices speaking on behalf of Ukraine and advocating for Ukraine today are women. We had Alexander Matviichuk, who was a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. That's just one example. But certainly, as someone's in that kind of field of Ukrainian studies who's had this sort of fight in the academic space and the media space to have my subject taken seriously and have people, and not necessarily me, but say, actually, you should speak to Ukrainians and you should look to this, you should look at this from Ukraine's perspective, and you should treat Ukraine as a kind of geopolitical subject and not an object. And that's often been quite difficult, and then you're often not listened to. I remember, writing an article some years ago about Ukrainian artists being conflated with Russian artists in a major exhibition here in London, and it's kind of how Ukraine was a really important part of this. It was about modernist art. This is about 10 years ago, and how Ukraine was being made invisible. And I remember that some of the reactions to that from academic colleagues being almost kind of sort of, oh, this is just someone being very petty and almost a kind of mocking tone. And now I think, you see that people are starting to take that finally seriously, that you can't just allow an empire to erase the cultures on its edges through violence, and that actually naming things correctly is important. The way that I remember reading, for example, a review in the London Review of Books. This is from a few decades ago of Robert Conquest's work on the Holodomor, and saying, "Oh, and he insists on using the Ukrainian spellings for names of places, as if this was something so kind of marginal and silly." But now, of course, all the major newspapers are spelling Kyiv in the way that it should be spelled. So,
They
in that
still can't
sense,
pronounce it correctly.
they still can't pronounce it correctly, but okay. So in that sense, maybe, but I think that the real Cassandras are these kind of many Ukrainian women in the public sphere who are speaking on behalf of Ukraine to foreign audiences, and they're really doing, I think, a great job of that.
I would just add that for many Ukrainians in the diaspora, we have been Cassandras for decades. And even some simple basic things, like I don't know how many times I had intelligent people ask me whether Ukrainian and Russian were really two different languages. So this, we have been speaking the truth about what Ukraine is, what it is to be Ukrainian, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture for very, 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 very many years. And people, not just intelligent people, but just, people who, or less than, people have dismissed that simply because, one, they don't know any better, and two, the Russian messaging and the academia messaging, which has always been done through the Russian prism, is very, very, very powerful. And while the war is a terrible tragedy, but it has also catapulted all things Ukrainian onto a different global stage, and many of those doubts and so forth have been dispelled. And probably, we have to be even louder Cassandras in this day and age than we have been in the past.
Yeah.
We have some more questions. I think Olya Pilipovich is the next.
Yeah.
Olya.
Go ahead.
Hey everyone, William, thank you so much for joining and leading into us for this whole discussion and answering our questions. What I want to ask, just like follow back and piggyback on the situation of Ukrainians of not being heard. Would you all agree or maybe disagree that it's possible that something else should have been done and not only the talking? So maybe the answer is not talking louder, but start doing something. What I'm trying to say here, because I want to come back actually to the play. So what Lesia Ukrainka is doing, she's taking an ancient myth being retold in Greek in a Greek literature already, right? I mean, so and she's retelling it from the Ukrainian perspective, and she herself being having actually very unorthodox upbringing, right? She has all the tools to be able to modify it further and maybe to offer something, some different outcome possibly, right? Instead, she chooses to stay within the classic retelling, only modifying it somewhat and localizing it somewhat, all right? And I feel, and so there is like a missed opportunity to send a message here. And particularly now when this particular play, Lesia Ukrainka, is part of the school program in Ukraine. And we are bringing up the new generation of Ukrainians. So what messages we are actually telling them by not trying, I mean, so to modify the outcome. All right, so that would be the question. So here's what I want to offer to consider. It seems like the whole myth, I mean, so was only doomed if you're looking from the perspective of saying or not saying, all right? But if you will consider, okay, so she's cursed and she's framed only in this perspective. But she could have done, right? I mean, so the Cassandra herself, she could have done multiple things. I mean, to change the outcome, and she chooses to stay in what she has. I mean, only speaking. So I am just curious: is it? It's only the part of the translation, so it has to follow the retelling and the story, or do you think, I mean, so it was her own decision, I mean, so only to strengthen the argument she's trying to make? But for the revolutionary that she was in her mind, I feel she could have gone much further. Thank you. One way or both?
Thank you, Olu. Wim, would you like to answer this question or share your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's a difficult one to answer. I suppose I guess it comes back around to this question of the role of literature and the role of the artist, the role of the writer in a society which is engaged in this kind of struggle for its existence, for its liberation. Um, and in those situations, writers, intellectuals are often expected to, yeah, like you said, provide the kind of roadmap towards liberation. What should we do to liberate ourselves? The writers, the artists are meant to show us and explain it to us and motivate us as well. That's a really important thing. So this is what Ivan Franko was doing. His all of his no most of his work is kind of aimed. It has this, of course, it has aesthetic dimensions and philosophical dimensions, but it also has this instrumental dimension whereby it's supposed to literature art is supposed to be a tool, an instrument for national liberation. It's meant to have like an impact in the real world. So it's meant to, it's meant to be a little bit like Hellenist thinks. We if we say things in a certain way, or the way that they accuse Cassandra, but more similar to Hellenist. If we present things in a certain way, if we tell the story in a certain way, people can follow the story and sort of fulfill the ending of the story as we want it to be told. Um, and that's a very common approach to literature and culture of the late 20th century. This sort of idea of positivism, which is very popular, especially in Polish culture and in Central Europe, the idea that art and literature is not necessarily about showing how things are, but more about showing how they should be, and it should be should have a social function, political function. And if it's not, it's kind of a waste of time. And I think, and so a lot of people were asking exactly this question back then. And I think Lesia Ukrainka was kind of resisting it to an extent because she and a sort of younger generation of Ukrainian artists who were that kind of first modernist generation, or the ones who came like slightly after her and Kobylanska, they were interested more in the autonomy of art, and that art should be, yes, it can be related to the national problem, but it's not limited to it, and it should do other things. And this is where probably people have heard this famous quote from Franco, who said, that Lesia Ukrainka is the only man in contemporary Ukrainian literature because he was particularly thinking about some of these younger modernist slash decadent poets who are all about kind of expressing inner feelings and emotions and individualistic and decadent. And he juxtaposes it to Lesia Ukrainka's poetry, which is much more that part of her poetry, which is much more kind of motivational and about liberation and about kind of breaking the chains and about action, like you say. And I think, and she certainly had that aspect to her work, but I think her best work is where she is actually exploring precisely that tension and precisely all the doubts and the uncertainties. And often, we could think of Cassandra as being an artist, of course. She could be a metaphor for the writer or the artist. We see there's one of the other plays which is set in the ancient world is the Orgy, and we see this is kind of Greece under like Roman occupation kind of thing, and we see Greek artists working in the service of the empire, but then and there's this tension of can you realize yourself aesthetically as an artist under these conditions of sort of foreign
As a
imperialism.
collaborator of the
Yeah,
occupying
as a
power.
collaborator, basically. Yeah, so like, like Gogol, there's the whole thing we think about Gogol. He kind of sold out Ukraine and moved to Russia to become a Russian writer, and and so we can have, kind of pretenzi do nього because of that. And she's obviously she didn't do that, and she never considered writing in Russian, but she's sort of exploring the fact, this kind of terrible tension between wanting to be an artist and fulfill yourself and make the most of your gifts and your kind of aesthetic gifts and your philosophical gifts, but also feeling the sense of responsibility to your community, and that I have to use those gifts for this specific purpose, to liberate my community. And it's, of course, these things, it's completely bound up. These things are completely entangled because she's a writer. She's using the language which is repressed, and the repression of the nation and of the language are the same. Um, and it leaves you in this very complicated and difficult situation. And I think that's one of the things that she's exploring in a lot of the work. And she's kind of kicking back a little bit against this idea of I have to provide the answers as a writer. But I suppose you could kind of turn it around and say, well, actually, what she's doing is contributing to the cultural the sophistication of the culture and the public discourse, which will make the culture and the society stronger and more resilient because it's more open to self-criticism, it's open to internal diversity, and that will kind of help it to become a stronger community. If you are kind of outlawing any differences of opinion, if you're kind of enforcing unity within the community, is that healthy for that community? Is that going to be ultimately healthy for this beleaguered this community under siege to survive? And I guess what she's saying is no.
We have a
So
couple of questions.
that wasn't a simple answer to the question, but
Well, I mean, it's a very complicated question. I've
Yeah.
spent most of my professional life working in journalism, and every now and then we would have these letters from listeners. Why don't you have more good news? Why don't you have things that make us feel better? And so it's what does that even mean? What does that question even mean? Sort of. Anyway, we have a couple of questions in our chat, and one of them sort of harkens back to something that we had talked about a little bit earlier from Tetiana Kolodich. Would Cassandra's voice be heard today, and what shaped Lesia Ukrainka into who she was, and who motivated her to write the way she wrote? Well, I mean, Willem will give the great answer, but all I know about Lesia Ukrainka from my Ukrainian school and my own sort of small research, she grew up in a very intelligent milieu. And so that's motivated her and inspired her to, not think about the price of cheese, but about things that are a lot higher.
Yep. And she was also homeschooled just to avoid to fall under the influence of the imperial propaganda.
yeah, and I think, and this is the role of Olena Pchilka, I suppose. So her mother
Mother.
was very important in that sense, and I think that she, as far as I know, she deliberately kind of held the children back a bit from the Russian imperial school system in order to kind of develop a different kind of consciousness, which obviously seems to have worked in Leslie's case. But also, yeah, she had the health problems which interfered with that, but in some ways interfered with her education. But she spent a lot of time when she was ill reading. It's kind of what she would do to deal with the illness, which was, I think, extremely difficult and very debilitating, and kept her immobile for long periods of time. She would read and she would write. So in some ways, the illness facilitated her the kind of depth of her learning, I suppose,
and a rich internal life.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the question would she be heard today is an interesting one. I mean, the first question is, yeah, have things improved for women to speak in public, to say things that people don't necessarily want to hear, to say inconvenient things, and I don't know if things have improved all that much. I guess a bit. But we still, again, to go back to this whole problem of the way that public discourse in our times, in our societies, happens often online, and that can be an extremely misogynistic space. The kind of abuse that people get these days would not be something that she would have experienced in her life. This kind of level of anonymous abuse that women get. So in that sense, perhaps worse, but in other senses, better in that, generally, I suppose women have more access to things like being journalists and being politicians than they did in her day. Although, we can look at the Ukrainian parliament and Ukrainian governments and cabinets and count how many women there have been there recently, and it's not too many. So I think there's still lots of work to be done in that sense. But yeah, I think her mother certainly, as someone who was also interested in the kind of the cause of women and the women's movement, was very, very important. But she also
held up as a pillar of Ukrainian feminism, Olena Pchilka.
Yeah, absolutely, and she certainly was. I listened to a discussion about Cassandra recently, and someone pointed out that Cassandra has this brother Helenus, and who is kind of the successful one and the one that everyone listens to and admires. And she also had an elder brother who was just old, they were very close in age, but a slightly older brother who was kind of the big hope of the family, who was kind of very sort of handsome and charismatic and talented, and everyone thought that he's going to be kind of the golden child in the family, and she was always a little bit of an afterthought, and especially because she was ill, so she was, we know that Olena Ptilka was a little bit sometimes frustrated with Lesia's health problems, and complained in letters about, Lesia's, it's such a hassle that Lesia is ill all the time. So I think she probably felt that a little bit in her own family, this kind of being compared to the male sibling, and the way that she is treated in that sense. I feel like maybe that is a little bit reflected in the play. And also, it's really important. The other family member who's really important to mention is Mikhailo Drahomanov, her uncle.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, well, she is Lesia Ukrainka, and he signed his works Ukrainets. So it's probably related to that fact. And the fact of him doing that was quite, at that time, was quite a gesture to say, to sign your works as Ukrainets. It was like not, not Little Russian or whatever, so it's and he certainly influenced her understanding of political issues and social issues and the kind of revolutionary cause and all of those kind of things, and sort of steered her towards socialism as well. But he was also one of those people who viewed art as in this much more utilitarian way and in the kind of populist spirit. And I think, again, you could see that she was, even though he was a huge authority for her, and she even spent quite a chunk of her life, when he was dying, looking after him, she was still willing to kick back against someone that had such authority for her. She always has this very remarkable kind of intellectual independence, which I think is really interesting.
Another question from Valia Levitska from Los Angeles. Hey, Val, it's good to see you. She's thanking us for this insightful discussion, and she poses a rhetorical question. Why does society so often prefer the comfort of illusion to confronting the harshness of truth? And does Cassandra bear responsibility for a foreseen catastrophe? This goes back to what you said earlier, Willem, the language and discourse. You made it happen just by saying it. So
Yeah, I mean, it all of these bad things don't happen just because of Cassandra. You know, there are more people involved. So I think it's um it's unfair to just kind of blame her. Um, I mean, yeah, the willingness of society to live to ignore inconvenient truths is it's just one of those things. I mean, it reminds me also of that movie that was on a few years ago about the asteroid. Do you remember that one? Don't Look Up.
Mm.
And so that kind of looked at this problem in a really clever way. And you had this asteroid coming towards Earth, and scientists who say we're all going to die. It was Leonardo DiCaprio, and I can't
Yeah,
remember who else was in
Meryl
it.
Streep. No?
Um,
it was
and of course there are people who deny it.
Jennifer Lawrence that is in it. Yeah,
And
Yeah,
who's the president?
it's a
Meryl
brilliant
Streep?
satire. Yeah,
No?
I don't remember.
I think she was there in that movie.
mhm. But yeah, you could see that it's there. That was a great kind of satirical look at this. It's so much easier to not face up to these things. You know, we saw it with COVID. You know, there were people who just did not want to face up to the fact that we're going to have to take serious measures to contain this virus, and vaccinations will be necessary and lockdowns will be necessary. But there was a chunk of people who just didn't want to know about it, and it's a lot easier to just think that you have to do nothing. I think someone's asking, Salomia is asking, what was the name of the movie? I think it's Don't Look Up.
Don't Look Up. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the name of the movie. Yeah.
Um,
Do we have any more questions? Does anyone else want to weigh in? We do have a few male participants in our discussion, so maybe if you would like to share your opinion, that would be really interesting to hear.
yeah, I'm very conscious that, we're talking about this amazing feminist writer, and all the questions are coming to me, as a as the man who can tell you all
Uh,
what to think about it.
Actually, do you know, if I can make just ask a personal question, Will, how did you what attracted you to Ukrainian literature? How did you get involved in this field? Because that's one thing that we didn't really explain when we introduced you. And
Yeah.
I'm rather curious about that because, you're a rare species.
Yeah, unfortunately. So kind of I mean, I basically started with studying Slavic studies. My BA degree was at the University of Glasgow, and I learned Russian and Polish. And actually, the reason I chose to study Russian initially was because I read Gogol when I was a teenager, and I just really enjoyed Gogol, and it was initially it
I'm
was
glad
like
you started with Gogol and not Dostoevsky.
well, yeah, and but of course, I was reading the Penguin Classics edition of Gogol, whatever, and it doesn't even say that he's Ukrainian there. So, after a little bit of study and a little bit of understanding things in a bit more depth, I was like, okay, so this is my favorite writer. He's actually Ukrainian. Maybe this Ukraine is interesting. And that's kind of one of the things that pushed me towards studying Ukraine. But also, what I realized was that in the classes I was taking in university and even going into the library, you couldn't really find information about Ukraine. You couldn't find many books about Ukraine. I was actually very interested to maybe write an undergrad dissertation about Ukraine, because I was sort of became very interested in not sort of studying the cultures and the literatures of like the non-Russian republics of like the Soviet Union. I thought that was kind of interesting, um, which I think maybe has something to do with being Scottish and being part of Britain and being a small country attached to a big country. There's some kind of parallels maybe, but it was very difficult to find any decent translations or any information. So it was more like after I graduated, I started to look into it a bit more, tried to learn Ukrainian and traveled to Ukraine a bit and just kind of yeah, really sort of fell in love with the place and decided to a couple of years later do an MA dissertation on Ukraine, contemporary Ukrainian literature, because I learned Ukrainian by reading the work of contemporary writers, like short texts by like Taras Prochaska and Yuri Andrukhovich. Later on, Oksana Zabushko as well, but it took me a while to get to her. She's not someone for beginners.
She's
Yeah,
definitely not.
yeah.
She's definitely not.
Whereas Taras Prochaska is quite a good one for beginners, you know, because he has these nice short texts that you
Yeah.
can sort of read with a dictionary, and it's not too complicated, you know. Um, yeah, and then so just kept going with it, and eventually did a PhD on contemporary Ukrainian literature, and that's how I ended up here.
Our organization is, we have several directions that we work in, and one of our sort of projects that will probably be around for many, many, many decades to come is this whole idea of decolonization of academia, of the arts, and so forth and so on. And we touched upon it a little bit earlier in our discussion that everything Ukrainian was always seen through a Russian prison. It was dismissed. It was even mocked.
Marginalized.
Marginalized, yes. So this is not exactly sort of in the Cassandra sort of vein of the discussion, but in the big picture, it is. How do you see this decolonization process going? Is it, with everything, there's a bit of excitement and then things wane off. Clearly, we're in a better place today than we were 5 years ago. But the Russian presence and the Russian imperial presence, because that's what it continues to be. It continues to be very, very, very strong. How would you sort of assess the progress that we've made in this decolonization process, especially in academia?
I think that some progress has been
And
made.
perhaps you have some ideas on how we can do it better.
Yeah, I think some progress has been made, but definitely not enough. It seems like that there is like a bunch of mostly kind of younger scholars who are Ukrainian often who are pursuing this. So there's even a new academic association called Ruta, which is was set up just a couple of years ago with this kind of ethos of decolonizing the field of like Slavic studies, East European studies, Eurasian studies, whatever you want to call it. And they have their conference in Zakarpattia in Ukraine. So that's great to see, and that there's a lot of really interesting people doing really interesting work. And I hope that that's going to be kind of like the next generation of people that are going to come through. A lot of those people are kind of younger academics or PhD students. But on the institutional level, I don't see a massive change. You know, I was kind of hoping that after 2022, we would start to see more universities invest in just like basic things like positions in Ukrainian studies. There have been very, very few of those. I mean, we're talking about like a couple. New programs. I don't see many new programs appearing anywhere. It's been we've seen like maybe there are some language classes being added here and there, which are basically like little add-ons to existing Slavic studies programs, which are completely, orientated towards Russian. I feel like I see that there are colleagues who want to do things a bit differently and think more critically. And I think at my university, we've had really good conversations with colleagues about how to like change a little bit the way that they're teaching Russia to kind of take more account of the history of imperial violence, basically, which is often not something that they want to dwell on because it's not very attractive to sell to enthusiastic undergrads who want to come and read Dostoevsky and Pushkin, and here you're going to come and tell them that, well, all of these writers were kind of implicated in centuries of colonial violence against multiple different nations, But still, I think those conversations have to happen, and I think I can see that certainly in my university, colleagues are having those conversations, but I can also see there are places where these things are not happening, and there's also places where it's really resisted. You know, I have really sort of witnessed colleagues at other universities, some of the big universities in the States who say, you know, like basically the people with the power and the authority in these departments don't want to know about it. So I think it's a shame. And I think that you can see that there just haven't been many new professorships or associate professorships created in Ukrainian studies at all. Very, very few. And that's a big shame. The universities are not investing because they are convinced that, I mean, with universities, I think it's the same in the US and same here. It all comes down to finances. And if this position is not going to generate income through student numbers, they don't want to create positions like that for academics. And they think that Ukrainian is marginal. It's like a niche subject. So I think what we have to do is explain to people that it's not, explain to people that it's you use this moment where Ukraine is absolutely this kind of at the center of geopolitics, where understanding, and if you want to understand what's going on in the world, which is, you know, has brought the world to the brink of World War III, then you have to understand something about Ukraine and what it is and what's happened there historically. That's how, you know, that's how I tried to make that argument, but it's quite difficult. But it's coming, it's getting there. Actually, this our school won a contract with the UK Foreign Office to give them some training on, you know, the region, this kind of, you know, I even hate using this word these days, but post-Soviet region. And they've got several Ukraine specialists on that program. So there's 3 different Ukraine specialists, including me, who will speak to these diplomats about, well, what we think they should know about Ukraine. And I think that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. I don't think they would
So,
have had Ukraine specialists there.
so
Firstly, because they
they,
wouldn't want them, and secondly, because those people don't barely even existed.
yeah,
So I think there is progress, but there's still a lot of work to do, basically.
baby steps. William, well, I think we're drawing to the end of our discussion.
Yeah.
It's been lots of fun. I really enjoyed it. And maybe let's go back to Cassandra and end with her and maybe a little bit of reflection. This may sound like a primitive thing, but if you whittle things down to one central idea that you would want readers to take from Cassandra, what do you think that idea would be? And also to our listeners, our participants, before you all go away, why don't you drop us a little note in the chat? Would you recommend this book to your American friends? And will you come back to reading it again?
Yeah, that's a good closing note.
So what would you one idea that you would recommend people that you would take away from Cassandra yourself, from Lesia's Cassandra, William?
I think it's this idea of, if we want to understand what it means to speak truthfully and honestly and with integrity at a time of crisis, then we should read this book. And I think that in the world we live in today, it's good for us to understand that. So yeah.
Thank you all for being a part of this very first conversation. And, starting something new always feels a little scary, but today showed how powerful reading together can be. And I would like to thank our incredible guest speaker for being the star of our today's discussion. And it's always a pleasure not only to speak, but to listen, especially to very generous and brilliant voices. And I really do hope that this is just the beginning of our collaboration. Our next book will be Love Life by Oksana Lutsishina. A totally different tone, but just as bold. Again, thank you very much. Have a great Sunday and talk to you all very, very soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Liam.
Bye.
You're
And
welcome. It was a
everybody,
pleasure.
read Ukrainian books.
Yes, yes. Read, recommend, share, gift. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.